Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial on creating a project with Node sequelize ORM, or sequelize ORM for Node.js. My name is Kyle, and let's get started. So in the last video, we went over how to in the last couple of videos actually, we went over user validation, then we went over how to check if a username already exists and check if an email is already taken. So now we want to take these two functions and merge them into this check if a user already exists. And if so, we want to then kind of exit out of here. So I actually should put probably something like, oh, well, yeah, user already exists. So let's return something. So return user. And don't try and create a new user. But if they don't exist, obviously we do want to create a new user. So let's do something like this. Okay, that makes more sense. And here's my neuropathies. One thing that I wanted to say going forward is, as I had stated, this is an actual real project that I'm working on, and I'm quite passionate about it. So I'm probably not going to do so much of this anymore and the explanation of why I'm doing something and that in-depth way of seeing things. Instead, you're probably going to get more of a feeling that I'm just coding and talking to you at the same time because I really want to get this moving along and get this out. So let's open up our editor. And here we have validate if a user exists. So we're in the user service. If we, so let's trace our steps first because it's actually been a couple days since I did this. So first, we're going to validate that all of the things that we were sent are actually correct. So here we have validation, and now we need to forward this to the user service. So we're going to say forward or invoke user service. Okay, so this is where we would forward it to the user service. If we look in the user service, we've already pushed these things together. So here we have two things. So we have username exists and email exists, and we're getting both of these from the user DB. Okay, and now we have this async function validate user exists. It's going to take in a username and an email. If the user or the email already exists, sorry, username, if the username or email already exists, then we're going to return that user. Remember that this is actually going to be a user. It's not just valid username. And also, I had changed these in the last video. I just had these called valid username and valid email. I realized that didn't make a whole lot of sense. So, because when you say like valid username, I think, oh, okay, this is a valid username. It must pass the test. It doesn't exist and I can use it. So we're going to say taken valid username or taken valid email. You could probably even shorten this to just taken email. But anyways, this is going to call username exists. Username exists, if we look at that in UserDB, this is tests. Oh my god. Here it is. If we look at username exists in UserDB, we see that if the username does exist, it's going to return that user, right? It's not returning that user username. So we could say this if we wanted to. We could say, okay, where I need it to be, user.username. Then we would actually be returning the username. But I want to return this whole user object. And why do I want to return this whole user object? Because I don't see any reason not to. I try to not be restrictive if I don't have to, unless I actually have a reason for saying, no, we should only return this user's username. I'm just going to return the whole user and let the actual calling function decide what it wants to do with that information. There's no need to add extra restrictivity. Is that a word? Restrictivity? Restrictiveness? either way, it adds complexity when you do something like that. So if you don't need to, don't do it. All right, so then this returns the user. If no user was found, it's going to return null. So up here in our user gateway, you were warned. So up here in our user gateway, we need to invoke this user service, and we have the user service being included right up here in user. So we'll say let or const user equals, let's actually say const found user equals user. Oh, it's going to be an async function, so await user dot, and here we have validate user exists. Okay, we see that we need to pass in a username and an email. So we'll say username and email. All right, and then finally we're going to say if found user, so that means that the user was actually found, then we're going to return res.status 400, okay, .json. And for the error, I'm going to say, we're going to do a template string here, username or email is already taken. And you know what? Actually, I don't want to do that, and I think someone can pretty easily figure out why. That's not really a great error. I'm telling you the user or username or the email is already taken. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. I want to know if the username was taken or if the email was taken. So let's be a little bit more explanative. So, or circumspect? I don't know. All right, so let's say if username equals found user dot username. Okay, then we're going to return res.status 400.json, and we'll say template string error template string username is already taken. Please. Actually, no. I'm not going to tell them what to do. It's just going to be that's already taken. Okay. Otherwise, if email is equal to found user dot email, return res.status 400.json, and then we're going to say error is equal to email is already taken. Okay, so now obviously if this runs, if this line runs, line 57, 58 isn't going to run. So that's perfectly fine with me that happens. Maybe both the username and the email were taken. I think that's going to be rare, but maybe they both were. first it's going to tell them that the username was already taken, and then if they did try and do it again with the same email, it would tell them this time that the email was taken. But either way, this is going to cut them short, and we're not going to have to worry about them being able to move forward from this. So now we're good. If we look at our little diagram here, we can see that we now are checking to see if the username already exists. So let's go ahead and gray that out. And now we want to create the user. So we're not actually returning the user, we're just returning an error message. That's what I should have put. So return error. Okay. If they weren't taken, now we actually want to take the time to create a new user. And it's been a couple days since I looked at this, so let's see if I actually already created a function to do this. I don't think I did. So here we have validate user exists. That's the only one in here. All right. So now let's create a function that is basically saying create a new user. First things first, let's think a little bit about this. So we are definitely going to need to touch the database in order to do this because we have to enter the new user. So the first thing I think I'm going to do is open up userdb test.js, and let's collapse some of these tests because there's a lot of them here and it's only going to get bigger. Okay. Oh, this is why I felt like I already created a user, because we have a create dummy user. So this is going to be very similar to what we're about to write. So right after this test, let's outline some requirements. And this is one thing that I find definitely helps me when I'm writing a test, is to think in terms of like, what should this actually do, and then what should it actually return. So first and foremost, let's say function should create a user. Okay. And let's make this a multi-line because we're going to have a lot of stuff here. So function should create a user. And then what do we expect it to return? So do we want it to return a new user? Yes. So we're definitely going to want it to return a new user. And then we might say new user should have properties, username, email. Ooh, hold on. Email, first name, last name, and password. So we know that this user should have these three properties, but we also want to say this: password should be a hash, not plain text. Okay. This is how we're going to test this then. So I think it's always a good idea when you're writing tests to figure out beforehand what you actually need to test, because this gives you some idea of what you need to write, and it prevents you from writing things that you don't need to. So let's create this test. We'll say it should create a new user. Okay, and then we're going to have some dummy information in here. That way, whenever this test runs, we know that it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. So kind of similar to this, but let's do that in some variables. So we'll say const first name, this is going to be a little bit boring, is equal to test. Const last name is equal to test. Const email is equal to test at test.com. Const password is equal to test underscore test. And const username is equal to test underscore test. Okay. So the reason that we want to make all of these is you could actually type these in, but we're going to create a function that's actually going to take all of these. So instead of typing all these in as arguments, we're just going to pass these variables. So now let's write out what we should expect and then watch it fail. So this is going to return a new user. So let's say const user equals an object. And then we're going to expect user dot to be an object. Now, I will admit, this does right here, this line, kind of requires you to know beforehand the code that you're working with and what it's going to return. And there are instances where you just don't know that. There have been plenty of times I've had to write code to see what the hell it's going to return. And then I write a test that basically verifies what I already see happening. And like, for example, this happened to me a couple days ago. I needed to verify that an image was a certain width by a certain height. And I used the Sharp library to do that. But I couldn't figure out what on earth the Sharp library was going to return. So I ended up writing the code and then testing it and seeing what it returned, and then writing the actual test that said, hey, make sure this return value has all of these. And, that's perfectly fine. You're not always going to know what these things are supposed to return. So now we're going to say expect user dot first name to equal first name. Expect user dot last name to equal last name. Expect user dot username to equal username. Expect user dot email dot to equal email. I'm not going to write the password version here yet, because although we're passing in the password of test underscore test, you should never be storing this plain text password in your physical database. It should be a hashed version, and we're going to see how we go about hashing that plain text version. So there is a way to test that this password is correct, obviously, but that's going to be a whole breakout function in and of itself. Okay, so actually, we're almost certainly going to have its own function that does this. So we are going to expect, yeah. Okay, so expect user.password.to.equal password. Okay. Now, the reason that we're going to expect this password that we entered to equal this password is that in this specific instance, we're actually going to treat this string as though it had already been hashed. And I say that because we're almost certainly going to have another function somewhere later down the line. It's not going to be this function that actually hashes this password and passes it to whatever function we're about to create. So we are good in testing that this user.password should equal this password. All right, so this is our test. If we run it, obviously it's going to fail because this user object clearly doesn't have any of these properties. So we wouldn't expect it to actually succeed. All right, so obviously we see that everything failed, actual undefined, so yep, we're good to go here. Real quick, I just remembered that I don't have any of my database going. So let's go example and start. Okay, so let's write a function here that actually does this. And like I said, it's going to look pretty similar to this. We just want to write enough code that this actually succeeds. So we'll write, instead of saying const user equals an object, let's actually just kind of borrow this code. So we'll copy that, paste it here. Now we obviously want to test some of this stuff, or not test, we want to change some of this stuff. So first name, we can get rid of, we can use destructuring for all of this. So let's go ahead and get rid of these strings. Oh, and here's something that I actually forgot. We need a permission ID. So let's test down here. Expect user.permissionID.to equal permission ID. And let's create that variable because it doesn't exist. So let's say const permission ID equals 1. Okay, so we have this const user equals await db user.create. And now if we run this test, actually let's not run this test real quick. Underneath that, let's actually create this destroy, because I don't want to have this user hanging around in our database. So we can do this right after this. I'm just going to put a little comment in here. Destroy user instance in database because it's a test. Okay. Let's see here. So this will take the user, it will destroy, which is great, and then user will still exist in this particular constant. All right, let's go ahead and test this. All right, we're good. So everything checked out. This user actually existed. So now let's take this and rip it into a function. So in userdb, let's minimize these two functions. And let's create another function called async function create user. And let's have this just take in a options. Not options, I don't like that. Args, let's call it args. That's pretty common. All right, and then in userdb test, let's grab this, copy it, go back into userdb and paste. So that works, but let's actually change this a little bit. So let's rip some of these off. Actually, let's just do this. Args dot first name. Args dot last name. Args dot username. Had to think of that for a second. Reinstalled. Args dot password. And args.email, args.permission ID. Okay. Now, I'm a big fan of making sure that anytime a function is invoked, it makes sure that any arguments it uses actually exist. Even though you might end up doing this on multiple levels, the reason that I'm a big fan of that is because it ensures that this function can be reused somewhere else and that the validation for using this function doesn't exist in a higher level. So the next tests that we're going to create make sure that args is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So in user db test, actually first off, let's export this function now. So create user. And then in user db test, all the way at the top, let's bring this in. Create user. And now we're going to replace this with that. So instead of user equals await db user.create, let's say create user. And we're going to pass it in some arguments. So let's say, hold on. We're going to do that. So we need to pass it in an args option. So let's create a new object here. So const args equals, and we'll just say first name, last name, email, password, and username, and permission ID. Okay. Pass in args. And let's make sure that this function actually, or this test still passes. So let's try running that. Uh-oh. Cannot read property destroy of undefined. So the connection was established successfully. Let's see here what might have happened. So let's make sure that everything is being passed correctly. Let's debug. So we'll go up here, debug. All right, args is equal to an object, first name, test, test underscore test, permission ID, and test at test. So this is good. Let's go to create users and see what that's actually doing. Create users. And okay, they're named the same thing. So let's do this. We'll put here and then we'll let it play a little longer. All right, so args is equal to an object, args.lastname, args.firstname. Oh, it's not returning anything. All right, so let's obviously have it return this user. User dot, or not return, user dot return user. All right, we fixed that. Now, there is one thing we have to do now, unfortunately, because clearly this had the ability to run. It just didn't return anything. So let's open up MySQL Workbench, because we're going to have to manually delete that user from the database. Later on, when we get down into the weeds, we're definitely going to want to be careful about doing something like this, just because we could easily create data, not just users, but data in the database that's only like halfway there, half full. That's why, one, it's very important to have a different development database than production database, but it's also sometimes different or useful to have a different test database than even your development database, because that means that if something does happen on the test database, you can just get rid of it and your development database will be unaffected. All right, so let's open up our local host. And go into our schemas. I want to view the users table of my own tutor. And here he is. So let's delete this row and apply. Okay, so that's deleted. We can go back into our test and run that again. And now it should pass. So stop and rerun. And it passes. All right, so we're good to go. I'm going to close this out.